Good evening. Thank you all for being here. My name is Christoph Ringer. I am Assistant Professor of Theological Ethics and Society here at Chicago Theological Seminary. And on behalf of the Center for the Study of Black Faith and Life, we welcome you to this space. And the center is dedicated to nurturing the next generation of prophetic leaders, those who will lift up the values of freedom and justice for another generation. And during Black History Month, we actually wanted to acknowledge one of our own, the Reverend Dr. Joanne Terrell, and to celebrate her groundbreaking and path-breaking book, Power in the Blood. Say amen, somebody. And so we have gathered together some extraordinarily brilliant people in the area who can really speak to the impact of this work, both in the academy as well as in the church and society. And we will be guided in our time tonight by Reverend Dr. Stephanie Crowder, who also is here at CTS. And if you would, you will notice these envelopes. Do you see the envelope? Yes, you are familiar with what these are for. In order to have such brilliant individuals with us, it does take resources. And so we would ask that at the end of this evening, if you would prayerfully consider making a contribution to the work of the Center for the Study of Black Faith and Life. And you'll see there is a basket over there, and it will be prominently featured as at the end of our program tonight. So we will begin, as I said, with Dr. Crowder, and she will lead us through the rest of the evening. Thank you so much.
What can wash away my sins? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. There is a fountain filled with, drawn from, and sinners plunge, lose all their, the blood that Jesus shed for me way back on Calvary, the blood that gives me strength from day to day. It will never lose its power. Would you be free from your burden of sin? There's power in the blood. Power in the blood. Would you over what? Would you a victory over evil win? There's what? Power in the blood. Yep. All of this salvation language is not produced in a theological, literary, or contextual vacuum. Our Bible boasts of blood-bought, body-for-body, sacrificial exercises and atonement expressions. From the Hebrew Bible, Dr. Stone, to the New Testament, this language is in sanguinary proportions. Leviticus 17:11 says, the blood makes atonement for the soul. 1 Peter 1:19 says, oh, the precious blood of Christ. Could it be that hymnody in many ways reflects bibliolatry? And yet it takes a womanist to flip these hymns on their sanguinary soteriological head. It takes a womanist to take these declarative hymns and to turn them into interrogatives. The hymn writer avers, nothing but the blood. But in light of the 17 killed just last week, in light of the 50 or so from Las Vegas, this womanist asks, can there be something, anything else besides blood? The hymn writer maintains that yes, there's a fountain filled with blood, but a womanist says, in light of the animals and our care for all of God's creation, must sinners plunge beneath a flood of blood? The hymn writer declares that, yeah, the blood that Jesus shed for me way back on Calvary, but in light of the Charleston 9, in light of 9/11, can there be another source that gives us strength from day to day? The hymn writer purports that yes, there is power in the blood, but oh, it takes a womanist to ask, power in the blood? Really? And so 20 years later, this question is still strident, and we've come to discern the theological, anthropological, soteriological, political, sexual, social, ethical, pastoral nuances related to this hematological discourse. What are the intersections in this book, Power in the Blood? What does Dr. Joanne Marie Terrell's question mean to us here and now? Well, let me introduce our esteemed panel as we ponder Dr. Terrell's inquiry. Dr. Stephanie Crompton holds a THD from another CTS, Columbia Theological Seminary. She's currently professor of pastoral care at McCormick Theological Seminary, and her work centers on a pastoral theology from a womanist perspective. Dr. Reggie Williams is associate professor of Christian ethics, also at McCormick. He has a PhD in Christian ethics from Fuller. His latest work is Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, where he really engages this idea of Jesus, race, and politics. And our esteemed, newly minted president, yes, Dr. Stephen Ray. That's all I need to say. And last but surely not least, Dr. Linda Thomas holds a PhD in anthropology from American University. She's professor of theology and anthropology at Luther School of Theology, and her work is rooted in what she calls intransitively womanist perspectives. And yes, our respondent, the one and only, Dr. Joanne Marie Terrell, holds a bachelor's from Rollins, and an MDiv, an MPhil, and PhD from Union Theological Seminary. Each of our panelists will have 8 to 10 minutes to share their perspectives and their discourse on this work, followed by a response by Dr. Terrell, and then we will open it up for questions. So friends, colleagues, bays, and boos, gird up your loins, and let's get it started up in here.
Thank you, Dr. Crowder, for your introductions. Dr. Ray, thank you so much for having us. I just have to have a little bit of self-disclosure. Part of me just got really giddy to be on this stage with these folks. A really good, gracious part of me I'm very glad to be here, Dr. Terrell, to celebrate your work, Dr. Ray, to celebrate your presidency, Dr. Thomas. That's all I can say, and my good colleague, Dr. Williams. So thank you so much. What I have to share this afternoon occurs to me as a reflection more so than fully formed thoughts, because I think it's okay to be consistently in reflection on our theological sources as we face the reality that as much as things change, they stay the same. But thank God for resources that help us to speak differently about the changes, even as some things still remain the same. So I'll start with this. When the social and theological pressure to bear up and survive makes itself known, there are ways in which we make sense of our predicament of being victimized by structures of oppression by reflecting on our central meaning-making symbol, the cross. In so doing, there's often a turning of sorts that is perplexing to me. It is a dangerous, but sometimes psychologically necessary shift that repositions our suffering as an act of self-sacrifice, rather than allowing us to identify that we indeed have been victims of oppressive relational practices and structural processes. I call it dangerous yet necessary on purpose. Dangerous because it positions us to at once suffer the blow, while also taking the blame upon ourselves by virtue of the fact that we have been bought into the belief that we are ontologically sinful, and as a consequence, it makes sense that we should suffer. Tough, ugly, embedded theologies. That we should take it even upon ourselves. Necessary and dangerous. We do this, even if it makes sense that our pain is occurring at the hand of someone else. To me, that is a deeply dangerous path because it reaffirms and justifies the alienation and self-alienation that Terrell decries. I also state that inasmuch as this reasoning is dangerous, it has also been necessary in that I see it as a way of protecting oneself psychologically from the fact that even when Black people do suffer at the hands of others, including other Black people, it is not safe to rightfully claim victimhood. Why? Because when you live in the threat of violence and danger on a daily basis, your daily existence includes a deep awareness that it is not safe to show the fullness of your humanity. Claiming and proclaiming your victimization requires that you not only defend, but that you place on display the intricacy of your wounds, which is in essence the plea to society to see me, see that I am a human, just like you. And who wants to do that? After generations of Black bodies have proclaimed to others, and even amongst ourselves, see me, know that I am a human, and worthy of love and respect, only to be met by interpersonal violence, structural oppression, and manifold evil that defile the tenderness and vulnerability that are required when rightfully proclaiming and implicating others, even if they look like you, in your victimization. And it hurts to the point that we question whether or not this brand of suffering is the will of God. So rather than draw down defiling ire of others implicated when we identify the ways in which we have been victimized and suffer, we take it upon our own selves in an act of self-sacrifice. And in so doing, we rightfully call on the one who knows what it feels like to show the sacredness of one's humanity only to be made to suffer. We turn to the cross, and rightfully so. In my mind, the psychological processes make sense. But in my heart, I still question, is it right? Is the way that we invoke the power of the cross to make sense of it all right? Does it sit well in my spirit that this is the situation, that this similarly may have been the situation for Jesus as well, The answer is no. And for this reason, I am deeply thankful for Dr. Terrell's work because it has offered me a critical tool for grappling with this. In her historical work on Black womanist thought, as well as on classic Christian doctrines of the Atonement, she has provided an invaluable resource that helps me trace the doctrinal heritage that sits in the background of my wrestling as a Black Christian woman who is sifting through the multiple religious and spiritual threads that inform my faith. One of the most helpful lines in Power in the Blood comes in the first page of her book for me. The words are discreet, yet powerful. She writes, I spent hours gazing at this artifact, pondering the implication of both its head-on and sidelong views for my native spirituality and nascent Christianity. She writes this about a piece of artwork in her home. It captured her memory and became a part of her meaning-making structures as she struggled with the reality of violence within and outside of her home. She opens the book with this memory, and her words, native spirituality and nascent Christianity, occurs to me as a contrast of sorts. Or at least I read it and take it as a contrast. I engage in my own process of meaning-making. I experience it as an affirmation of my own sense of knowing God before professing at age 10, or reaffirming at age 25 belief in Jesus, who I had come to read about. But before I read about Jesus, I knew God. I knew God's presence, and it was a loving presence. This knowing, this owning of my native spirituality, which Dr. Terrell has given me words for, has grounded me as I wrestle with my earlier question, but is it right? Being able to own my native spirituality that proclaims that God does not condone my suffering, nor anyone's, or even Jesus' suffering, as I work through externalizing the impact of having digested atonement theories, has been invaluable. Similarly, her text also offers important footprints that help me trace the who, what, when, how, where, and why of the connections that we make between God, Jesus, and sacrifice in ways that make suffering synonymous with sacrifice. For this, I am deeply thankful for Dr. Terrell's text. I can say that the power in the blood that runs through this text lies in the questions it evokes and her affirmation to search for meaning by first owning one's native spirituality. Thank you.
So I have to go after that. I'm the sidekick. Up here, I am the little brother who happens to be tall. I'm grateful to be on this illustrious panel. I'm very honored to be here with you all. Really thankful for Dr. Ray, and as I sent him, I'm just going to go ahead and be transparent, a text the other day. I saw a picture of him on Facebook standing up here as the president of this institution, and it just did my heart so much good. He has been a mentor to quite a number of us in the academy. I am one of the beneficiaries of his mentorship. And I make, just to be clear, a lot of the things that have happened for good for me in the academy have been the result of his mentorship. And I'm very grateful, very grateful. CTS has done themselves a huge favor for their future in bringing him in as the president. So I'm grateful for his leadership here. We ought to, just one more time. And to be on this panel talking about this book, what I want to share with you are some reflections that I had a number of years ago. When I entered into a PhD program, one of the orienting ideas for me, or at least schools of thought, was Womanist Theological Ethics, and I was introduced to Dr. Terrell's work at Fuller, of all places, many years ago. And it came back to me. This text came back to me when I came to McCormick. And the dean was telling me who they could have had, while he was introducing me to the seminary. He's introducing me to the seminary. You know, we missed out on Dr. Joanne Terrell. You know her? I was like, oh, yeah, I know Dr. Terrell. He said, yeah, we missed her. Well, thank you. I feel grateful to be here, too. Thank you. This was very formative for me. In the context of seeing myself as a theological ethicist, taking not abstract and conceptual ideas as the departure point for understanding how to live well in the world, but concrete and embodied social engagement as the departure point for understanding what it means to live a moral life. The way in which we see that and can recognize that as good, and reframing living well, love your neighbor as yourself, comes from us not from the history of the white masculine academy, but from black women. And more importantly, for our celebration this evening, from this genius right here. So what I want to share with you are just a few thoughts here based on the atonement. Kelly Brown Douglas puts Dr. Terrell's work in conversation with Dolores Williams, and I thought that would be interesting for us this evening. In her book, What's Faith Got to Do with It? She's engaging within the blood. The influence of Platonism and the Enlightenment within dominant Christianity exploited the core Christological paradox articulated at the Council of Chalcedon. The result has been to demonize the body and flesh and divinize soul and spirit, to value mind and reason over sensory experience. Yet some scholars emphasize the incarnation as an indication that God is partial to human embodied historical realities. The community of the oppressed has the best perspective on God's embodied partiality and God's atonement work on behalf of humanity. Kelly Brown Douglas says that black Christians embraced the Platonized faith of the dominant white culture, but used a hermeneutic of appropriation to identify God in an expression of faith that was consistent with African American experience. The black Christian worldview held intact the incarnational paradox, as she calls it, not the dualistic faith of white Christians with its fleshly, spiritual, good, bad, binary distinctions. The emphasis on a closed monotheism, Douglas argues, fostered a belief in retributive suffering, the belief that suffering is just reward for wrong behavior. So as Dr. Crumpton described, the intrinsic suffering of black bodies is something, the suffering of black bodies points to something intrinsically immoral or bad about black. Black people were identified with unrestrained bodily passions and made worthy targets of Christian oppression. Platonized Christianity plus power, this is one definition of racism, fueled racism and created a deadly combination that gave sacred license to terrorize black people in this country and played a prominent role in the defilement of black women. Douglas argues that early Anglican efforts to evangelize slaves failed because they required slaves to declare that by becoming Christians they were seeking spiritual freedom from sin, not physical freedom. Yet slaves made use of the hermeneutic of appropriation to hear God in the midst of their lived reality and accept the gospel on God's terms, not the oppressor's. Abstractions present within the metaphysical Platonic Christianity have been a storehouse for oppression within the Christian community. The abstract, metaphysical, conceptual world has been a storehouse of oppression for black people. The recovery of Jesus, fully human, fully divine, in a seamless Christian expression can return us to awareness of the gospel's concern for our concrete lived experience. For example, when we preach the gospel as a call to live a life of sacrifice to a community in poverty, we do not pay attention to the concrete lived realities of their existence. How does that impact their way of living? What do they have to hope for on earth? For a community that has no choice in paucity or scarcity as a way of life, we would need to reevaluate the life of sacrifice, life as sacrifice gospel. Womanist theoethicists share these concerns in relationship to the traditional atonement language. For a community that has historically had no choice in suffering, traditional atonement language that glorifies Jesus as suffering servant inadvertently divinizes the affliction of innocent victims within society. How do we talk about suffering in a way that does not divinize the suffering of the oppressed? What happens to the language of sin, repentance, and forgiveness in our re-evaluation? Dolores Williams describes a focus on the cross as divinized suffering and a harmful concept in light of the suffering of black people, particularly black women. Sin for Williams is not personal distance from God, but social. Jesus is killed because of sin in society and not vicariously for sin. Also, sin is described as individual compliance with the death-dealing forces of racism, sexism, and classism to perpetuate the suffering of the marginalized. There is no glory in the cross. A response to sin for Williams is not deliverance through death, but resistance, as modeled by the example of Jesus' life. Katie Cannon, Jackie Grant, Emily Towns, these are people who provide us with a dynamic Jesus as liberator, who also drives their ethics and provides a prophetic re-evaluation of atonement language for the suffering community. But it is Dr. Douglas who in her interaction with Dr. Terrell, that I'm bringing to light here. She brings these womanist views, or the womanist perspective, a perspective of womanist engagement with atonement together in what I found to be a very rich discussion of the atonement. In her comparison, Dr. Douglas compares Dr. Williams to Dr. Joanne Marie Terrell's views on the atonement to reevaluate the cross in the black community. Dr. Terrell argues that Williams does not fully appreciate the place of the cross in the African American experience. Dr. Terrell agrees that God sent Jesus into the world for honorable purposes and that the cross represents the most heinous act of evil perpetrated against humanity and divinity in history. But the cross is most significantly a demonstration of God's love for humanity. Terrell argues that it demonstrates to what lengths God will go to be at one with black women in their suffering. The resurrection is a symbol of their continued empowerment. Douglas calls this God's compassionate solidarity in reflection on what Dr. Terrell has done. God's compassionate solidarity. She's careful to balance the appreciation of the cross in black life with Williams' cautionary assessment of the danger within the language of redemptive suffering. What she arrives at is atonement language that addresses the language of what she means, what she is doing here with the language of revelatory privilege, compassionate solidarity, and kenosis. Jesus' crucifixion reveals the revelatory privilege of the least regarded and the defining integrity of divine power. It is among the least regarded, what she's calling revelatory privilege, among the least regarded that God chooses to make God's self known. Not in the halls of power, not from Herod's palace, from the White House, but from amongst the least regarded. God's partiality for the oppressed goes far beyond impassive identification. The crucifixion proves this point. The crucifixion demonstrates God's compassionate solidarity with the oppressed. Jesus in solidarity with the oppressed in their humiliation is how we speak of the kenosis. So these are the three pieces to take away from this. The kenosis of Jesus, a central term to incarnational language. The language here that connects is kenosis compassionate solidarity, revelatory privilege, all coming together in a self-emptying, not only to Jesus' act of obedience to God, but rather to his divestment of anything that would obstruct his absolute compassionate solidarity with the most oppressed. Here is the point here. By paying close attention to maintain the integrity of the incarnation and guarding against sanctioning violence, her language of the atonement revalues the work of God through Jesus in a way that I find most appealing. And I'll save the rest for conversation.
Well, first, let me thank my colleague and friend of many years, Dr. Christoph Ringer, for including me in this august panel, because there is a way in which the reputation and the work that's done by all of the people gathered here, I am humbled that my name even shows up on the same bill as theirs. So I want to thank you for that. I want to thank Dr. Terrell for a wonderful work, and I want to welcome you all to CTS. So what I'm going to do with this is situate the work. I'm not going to make a lot of comment on substance, and the reason why is because unless you dig way down deep into my CV, you would have no reason to know that my first published article in 1996 was published in a small denominational journal, and the title of the article was Black Women's Lives as Theological Source. And part of why I share that with you is because for me, my entire theological career has been shaped by the people who shaped me, who were Black women. I was raised by a single mother. So part of what I listen for is whether or not what a theological proposition, statement, or framework is saying rings true from what I know of her life. So as a consequence, what that means is that as I'm looking at Dr. Terrell's work, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make some glancing references to some substantive pieces of the work when I get to the end, but I'm much more interested in placing her work alongside others who are trying to speak truly of the deepest things of theology, allowing those things to be illumined by the lives of Black women in particular, otherwise known as the unction of Womanist Theology. I wish that before I wrote the article, I had read your book, but your book came out a little bit after I wrote the article, but I wish I had. So first, let me properly situate the work, at least as I understand it. When the book was first published, the dominant streams of theological work that treated womanism were primarily as a theological midrash on certain women in the Bible, Sisters in the Wilderness, of course, as an ethical discourse concerned with, while at the same time being rooted in the project of seeing the sacred in the lives and doings of Black women. This was the work that was emerging from Emily Towns and Katie Cannon, as well as a systematic response to the gendered presumption of Black theology. Because a significant piece of the work that was going on in womanist thought was trying to remind us how gendered Black theology was. As well as, and this becomes an important thing, is that during the time this book came out, it was also swimming in the stream of feminist theology that got it after reading Jacqueline Grant's work. And so, that's sort of the broad stream of where this work is situating itself and identifying the stream that it is flowing in. Now, what distinguished this work, and I think continues to distinguish this work, which is why it's still in print 20 years later, And anyone who knows anything about academic publishing knows that a book that is still in print 20 years later, and you don't have to buy print on demand, is a book that has significant value in its field. So what distinguishes this work is that it is one of the first works in womanist theology that takes up doctrinal issues, very specifically issues of atonement soteriology and some hearkenings to Christology, but it takes up doctrinal issues, then presumes to use its discrimen, the common sense of womanist thought and black women's lives. So rather than taking some other theological presupposition to use as a prism to interpret the lives of black women and womanist thought, she's allowing those to actually interpret the construction of a theological category, specifically a doctrinal category. So hers was groundbreaking in that regard. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to lay out for you the stream it was flowing in. This usage prefigures, by at least a decade, the granting of normative status to these conversations and the use of black women's lives and womanist thought as being normative. She presages by at least a decade conversations that move simply beyond methodology. So there is an entire period when, after this book comes out, and it's coming out at the same time, that virtually every book that you read on womanist theology is actually telling you about womanist theology, but isn't doing it. So this is one of the significant pieces of work that really begins to turn the corner. And I mean, I think as you try to understand its significance, that becomes important. Now, what distinguishes this work as well is that, to my awareness, it is the first work of a black theologian writing in the oeuvre of womanist or black theology that might properly be characterized as sacramental theology. It does this by quite specifically taking black life as sacramental. And to my knowledge, and I'm decently knowledgeable about this stuff, to my knowledge, this is the first work that does that, and it does it in an exemplary way that people are still trying to figure out how to do. Now, given the weight of the Western theological tradition that presumes that black life is an object of ethical concern, to posit the idea that it in and of itself is of sacramental significance is groundbreaking, if not astonishing. Now, the final point which I want to take note of are the cracks through which the face of God peers from unusual places in this work. And I think that this is actually, Dr. Terrell, I'm going to say that I think that even as you were writing, that God was opening some cracks that you may not even have been seeing at the time, but would become consuming later on. We see in this work the first glimpses of Dr. Terrell feeling the grace of God. Now notice I used the word feeling. The grace of God in a way uncharacteristic of most black theological discourses of the time. Where most black theological discourses of the time, and largely even till today, want to either situate the presence and the gaze of God in diasporic traditions or in the traditions of the ancestors, her passing reference to now I'm going to say this wrong, Bhagavad Gita, at the same time that she is reflecting on Mamie Till Mobley and traditional Christian notions of the sacramental notions of suffering, she is actually breaking the loop of self-referential captivity that much black theological discourse is in, which is that the only grounding that we find for ourselves is in our own experience with God, that our experience with God doesn't illumine anything else about anyone else's experience with God. So she shatters that loop in this work. And that's what I talk about in terms of cracks through which the face of God peers from unusual places. Now, the last move, and this is perhaps the most interesting to me, because it presages Dr. Terrell's journey into mysticism, which is something I think that I don't quite have the words for yet. But it is central to the claim that black life is sacramental, because if it is the case that black life is sacramental, if we don't have these other places that the gaze of God comes to us, then it can't possibly be the case that black life is sacramental, because if it is, and this is where I think her mysticism is leading us, because if it is, it means that the expression of life through the embodiment, beings, doings, and lives of black people cannot be reduced to the discursive categories of a single performance of Christianity. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I want to take a moment to share, in a womanist way, a little bit of a subjectivity. I was late today, unexpectedly. A friend that I had been calling all week because I'm taking care of her dog, I found out that she died. I had not known that she had died. I was calling her because I'm going out of town tomorrow, and so I want to say her name, Doria Johnson. Say her name, Doria Johnson. I, too, want to congratulate Dr. Ray on this distinguished move in your vocation, called by God to serve in an institution that couldn't be finer. So I'm so happy for you and your family. And my colleagues on the panel, thank you so much for sharing. You all have set me up in a very precarious but I think helpful way. And finally, Dr. Terrell, I love this woman. I love you more. So my comments are going to be developmental, setting Power in the Blood in a context, maybe a little differently than what's been done already. As you know, it was Alice Walker's book that the springboard for Womanist Theology and Ethics started, and black Christian women put a spin on the word that led to theological and ethical questions. But I would also argue that there were sociological and anthropological concerns being raised as well. It was Dr. Cheryl Townsend Gilkes, a sociologist of religion, who put together the papers, turned it into the AAR for the establishment of the womanist approaches to religion and culture group of the AAR. And notice that it's religion and culture. So this is very important for a person like me who grounds her work in constructive womanist theology and as an anthropologist. From my perspective, Womanist Theological Reflection was birthed at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, which is where I'm going tomorrow. But it did not have one mother, it had three. Doctors Jacqueline Grant, Katie Cannon, and Dolores Williams. I was an MDiv student when all three of them were getting their PhDs. Can you imagine that? Then, I'm going to call you little sister right now, because I was there first. This is so wonderful to situate it like this. Callie Brown Douglas came, then me, and then Dr. Terrell. So I felt like I was sitting at the feet of the monumental. And at that time, while Union Theological Seminary had black male professors, there were no women who were black. And as I think back, I had three black professors, they just didn't have their PhDs yet, is how I look at that. So I call what happened at Union the New York School of Womanist Theology. And I also want to acknowledge that black women across the country who were first generation, Renita Weems was finishing her work at Princeton. Emily Towns was here in Chicago and Evanston. And the publications began to roll out. It was such an exciting kind of thing. And so now we stand with a legacy of articles and books. The generativity of womanists cannot be matched. But part of that generativity has to do with doctoral students. Doctoral students who were in their final stages of their PhD, and that would be you too, Dr. Terrell. The generativity and flourishing, I think, provided by having a space to eat, drink, and live scholarship is how this womanist experiment and now lived experience has come to birth. And it is a garden that is well tended, and while it was planted initially by Alice Walker's mother, it continues to grow, and flowers are still blooming. So I talk about the emergence of womanist theology as a process and a product. I've talked about the process. Now I want to say a few things about three seminal articles. The first one was in 1979. Jacqueline Grant wrote the article, Black Theology and the Black Woman. It appeared in the book Black Theology, A Documentary History, and her essay sets forth an analytical critique of black theology of liberation. She asked this question, quote, where are black women in black theology? And she asserted that they were invisible, and it leads her to the analysis of the black church and black experience for further understanding. So, again, she wrote this article when she was still a doctoral student. Dr. James Cone was her advisor. And you know you have to be a womanist to say to your professor, your doctoral professor, hey, what you say is not so. Am I right? I mean, I'm scared of her. To James Cone, of all people. So that's what she did in raising the questions in that article. Concerning the black church, Grant highlights its hypercritical nature regarding the issues of women's ordination, leadership positions, and the overall status of black women in the black church. And she argues that women must be seen and acknowledged as the principal players in the church. Therefore, if black theology was not talking about them, then it was not a liberation theology for black people in total. Lastly, in respect to the Black experience, Grant draws upon the correlation between the Black church and Black community. She proclaims the status of Black women in the community parallels that of Black women in the church. So this is why Black Panther, the movie, is so important. The Black women were in leadership and they were in the community. They were the mothers who were giving life. If you all have not seen the movie, you have to go, because the striking leadership of Black women, I'm telling you, now I see where we get our stuff. Really. So then, in 1985, 6 years after Grant's seminal article, another groundbreaking essay appears, written by Katie Geneva Cannon. It's titled "The Emergence of Black Feminist Consciousness." The aim of this article is to challenge the systems of domination of social constructs using scholarship to deconstruct as well as give a critical analysis of said systems. A historical overview is given through literature which shares Black women's experience, which gives relevance and validity to the struggles that we face. From an ethical standpoint, the challenge is not to lose sight of relating to others on all levels in a way that respects collective differences as the community of humanity. In other words, she is dealing with the history of Black women in a way that I had never seen it dealt with before. And if you don't know the article, it is critical for you to read it. It is a deep history of Black women in the United States. And the essay delves into the origins of Black feminist consciousness. And by so doing, Cannon notes the influential role of religion in the lives of women during slavery, which you go back to when you begin to talk about Black religion. And in light of the struggle for human dignity, the struggle against white hypocrisy, and the struggle for justice, the roles of the Black church and Black women are very crucial. Significantly, Cannon does not hold back in talking about the history of racism, sexism, race, classism, hate, but also hope. According to Cannon, the church, and especially the Bible, as God's words, has served to enrich, uplift, and provide sustaining hope in God's justice for Black women. The last paragraph of the article uses the word womanist consciousness. This is the first time the word womanist is used in an article. Okay? So Jackie Grant talked about toward a Black feminist consciousness. Now, Katie Cannon is talking about a womanist consciousness. And she's talking about a consciousness as a theological and ethical construct. And so this article launches Womanist Ethics, where Cannon makes the signature move asserting that the experiences in everyday life of Black women are overlooked, if not dismissed, across disciplines, especially noting religious and theological studies where women have played a pivotal role. So that's the second move, womanist consciousness. Now, in 1987, Dolores Williams writes the article. See, you all were talking about the books. I'm going to the articles because the articles really were foundational for the books to be written. So in 87, Dolores Williams' article, Womanist Theology, Black Women's Voices, was published in Christianity in Crisis. And this time, the notion of womanist is linked to theology. She uses the word womanist theology. And so there we go, 1987. And she provides a further examination of womanist ideology by exploring Alice Walker's definition. And she talks about survival of life. Quality of life is her signature point, which she makes a move where the cross is there, but she really wants to focus on the life and ministry of Jesus during those 3 years, and that's to set the pattern for what it is that we're to do. So now, Dr. Terrell walks in. She's studying with Dr. Cone. Dolores Williams is on her committee. See, I got the, I'm all up in it. And she's saying to both of them, I got something new. And the something new to me is her personal story. Her subjectivity in talking about the way her mother died. That piece that anthropologists call reflexivity and womanists call subjectivity is what makes this book so powerful, because she's saying there has got to be power in the blood because my mama is dead. Yeah. Am I telling the story right? Oh, that messed me. I can't get into all that, but it's theological experience, but it is brought together by the conflict, the way that women were treated by black men is front and center, because Dr. Terrell had to deal with that and come to some peace. And that peace comes through mysticism. She loves Howard Thurman. And she also is the first womanist, as far as I can tell, who deals with interreligious concerns. So when people say that, we're all doing the same thing, no, we're not. Everybody is bringing some particular difference. And that leaves the field open for anybody who wants to confess to be a womanist to have her own point of departure. That's the beauty of womanist theology. You're building on, and yet it's unique. So I think that my colleagues have given some of the content. I do want to mention one other article, though. I would be remiss. And that is in 1993, Renee Hill, an out lesbian, brings the first critique to womanist theology. And that is her article, Who Are We for Each Other? Sexism, Sexuality, and Womanist Theology. And she talks about the complexity of oppression in the United States, and that Christian womanist theologians have recognized that both race and gender oppression must be confronted. And some have named that class is a third component. But Renee says, quote, however, Christian womanists have failed to recognize heterosexism and homophobia as points of oppression that need to be resisted if all black women, straight, lesbian, and bisexual are to have liberation and a sense of their own power. So I've given you this journey, this continuum, if you will, of how womanists came together, how it was in New York City, how Dr. Terrell was in New York City, who she studied with, who she challenged, and it's just a joy to speak both intellectually and also personally, and that's what we womanists do.
I don't really need this. I can just... understanding, who teach me very much by your scholarly contributions, but also by your personal examples of excellence and of sense of duty to what it is that we do as we engage the tasks of academic activism. I've always called it that, academic activism, because I never really could understand what it means to be an intellectual just for the sake of being an intellectual. I never could understand that because I had this ongoing life experience that was hard. It was hard coming up in a violent family. It was hard coming up in the midst of poverty and in the midst of questioning what it is that my purpose in being here was. It was hard reconciling all of that hard experience with the beauty of the earth, with the way that nature always seemed to affirm everything about me and everything about what it means to be alive. And so I am truly very grateful for what have been my experiences that led up to writing Power in the Blood. And it takes me back to, I had this I was in this emotionally abusive relationship. I didn't recognize this at first. If I had recognized it at first, I would have never gone that way. But I was in this emotionally abusive relationship, and one day, the fellow who I was in a relationship with came up to me and said, I have this other woman. I don't know what I would do if she left me, so I'm going to stay with her. I said, okay, fine. You go hang out with her. I'll be all right. So that night, after he'd left, I found myself on the floor crying and carrying on and stuff. And my ancestors came to me in that moment. They kind of lifted me up off the ground and said, what are you crying for? You didn't even love him. I'm telling this story because it is connected to what we're talking about here tonight. So the next night, he came to me again, and he said, I don't know what I would do if I would lose you. So I told her that, I'm going to stay with you. I said, it's too late now. I said, I got the victory now. So this woman, who was his other friend, tried to kill me. And I told him, I said, she had tried to kill me before he came to me. She tried to kill me before, and so she literally tried to kill me. And I told him, Jesus died for you. I don't have to. I don't have to. I don't have to. But that and other things got me to thinking, well, what is the purpose of Jesus' death? Another thing that came to me was when I was in seminary, and I had this flashback memory of the scene the morning after my mother's murder. And it was her handprint in blood on the wall, and the people taking out the blood-soaked mattress on which her murderer had lain her body. And as I received this flashback memory, I'm quite mystical, as you probably have guessed, I said out loud, Jesus didn't die for me. My mother died for me. And I was actually taken aback by that statement that came out of my mouth because I had been convinced by the story of Jesus. I had been convinced that his suffering was more important than everybody else's suffering throughout the history of people. I had been convinced by that. So I was kind of taken aback by my own confession that came right out of my mouth. Jesus didn't die for me, my mother died for me. And I know that in a way that was true, but I had to figure out, the ways that it was true, and the ways that, and the reasons for my resistance to it coming out of my body, out of my mind, out of my heart like that. And so that began my journey to writing Power in the Blood, ? The Cross in the African American Experience. I've not wanted to simply have that be a book about my suffering. It is about my suffering and my story, but it's about so many stories that connect with that story in profound ways. And I wanted there to be some truth to the idea that the suffering of God connects with our suffering. I wanted that to be there to be some experiential truth that was explored in the text. That God really does care, and that, you know, this is not the way God imagines our world, or even God's intentions for any of us, including Jesus. So it was an exploration. It was a deconstruction of the claims of evangelicalism on my religious imagination about God. Evangelicalism says that Jesus' blood loss is more significant than everybody else's, no matter if it's 6 million Jews or 5 million others, or if it's the 4 million or so people who died during the Middle Passage, or those who have died since, or my mother's blood loss. I didn't think that's what was being signified. So I did the work, the hard work of just trying to discover the antecedents of the confession that there is power in the blood. So I did that work not to disprove anything that Dolores Williams had said, but in order to have her critique be much more profoundly rooted in respect for the traditions that have moved people along, but also so that it could be a better resourced critique, I think, of the language that we use and of the way in which we think about sacrifice, and particularly the sacrifice of Jesus, as dismissing the suffering of all other folk in the world. I really wanted not to do that. And I wanted to think about what Jesus had done from the perspective of the myth having some validity, that God suffers this, that God suffers when people suffer, that God suffers with us, that God's willingness to go to the cross, to connect with our suffering, is something to be revered, something to appreciate God for, but never again to be emulated. That is the other part of the argument there, is that this, according to Christian confession even, is a once-for-all sacrifice. A sacrifice that comes from God's own agency and not from our imposing the duty to sacrifice on any. The duty of women to bear the brunt of masculinist theology or not the duty of LGBTQ persons to sacrifice their identity and agency for the sake of some confession that is universally prescribing. The sacrifice of other people's religious truth, the truth of their own journey and walk with God, and whatever it is that they have that is revelatory for us, for all of us. And so I wrote the book. I'm still challenged sometimes to think that I actually wrote it by myself. Because there are places that writing it took me that I didn't expect to go. I didn't expect to find occasion to be as faithful as I apparently have been in my desire to see in other faiths and to hear in other faiths the voice of God. I was able to be faithful to that. And in many ways, I feel like I illegitimately claim to be the author of this text. But at the same time, I don't want to dismiss my agency, my thoughts, my responsibility for what's in the text either. Because there were times when I wanted to say something else, but something else came out. There were times when I wanted to give up, but I had to go back and continue to tinker with the doctrinal truths I was messing with. And there were times when, there came a time finally, when the Spirit spoke to me and said, it's enough. It's not perfect, but it's enough. And I was in chapter 3, tinkering with that. And I remember stopping as soon as the Spirit said that to me. I was in the middle of a sentence that I had completed, but I hadn't completed the thought. And it's still in the book in that incomplete way. The thought is incomplete. I can't even remember which page it's on, but it's in chapter 3. There's an incomplete thought, even though the sentence is complete in structure. But I stopped immediately once the Spirit said to me, it's enough. And I packed it up and I put it in a FedEx container, sent it to James Cone, and here we are. Discussing it. I'm profoundly impacted by this, by the gift of my experience, which hadn't always been easy, but it's always been accompanied not only by the Spirit of Jesus, but by the spirit of my mother, the spirit of the Buddha, the power of Krishna, the joy of Krishna. I've been accompanied through all of this journey, and I'm pleased that I was chosen to write that work. Thank you for discussing it and celebrating it with me tonight on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of its publication.
We've had such robust presentations and responses. We've run out of time. It is 6:27, and I know that people have to get to class.
Not my class.
Not her class. Unless, can we take maybe one question, and then if people have to get to class? There is a question.
Thank you very much. This has been a wonderful, we could have a semester-long seminar here. When I read this book, I was at Union, New York, from 1981 to 83. There was a German feminist theologian speaking there, Dorothea Zola. She had written a book in the mid-1960s. The German title is The Stellvertreter. The English title is Christ the Representative, a theology after the death of God, in which she critiques both Anselm and Karl Barth's understanding of the atonement. And I've often wondered, was there, between Dorothea Zola and the three womanists that you named at Union, was there any communication between them? Was there any sharing of ideas? Because Dorothea Zola's book, A Feminist Thought, is the first one I know of in the 60s that really goes after atonement theory.
Thanks for the question. I remember her very well. So I don't think there was necessarily anything formal, but we all knew each other. And there was certainly a conversation between, during my day, and I was there from 78 to 81, a conversation with white women who may or may not have been feminists. There was a women's center, but Dorothea was so incredible, and I remember her and Beverly Harrison being very close, and Dolores and Katie were all part of that circle, for sure, and I was impacted by her as well. Carter Haywood was there as well.
I did meet Dorothy Zola. She was at Union on a sabbatical leave when I was there. She didn't really teach, but occasionally she preached in chapel. And I was very impressed by To Work and to Love. And it gave me, it kind of gave me permission as a graduate student to be absolutely honest and to be my loving self. You know, my loving self in a way that, you know, I can critique Dolores Williams without being anti-Dolores Williams. I'm not anti-Dolores Williams. I'm very grateful, and I lean on the work of Dolores Williams in a profound way to write Power in the Blood because she provided the questions. She didn't provide the answers, but she provided the questions. That is her gift, is to ask the right questions. And it's a profound gift. And so I'm deeply appreciative of her for introducing me to the work of Dorothy Zola, and then finding in that the kind of existential passion and connection for the work of doing theology. So.
Do you have a question on this side? One more question, perhaps? Jada says no, but anyone?
You have another question.
Dr. Terrell, go ahead. Go ahead.
The critique of the cross and Jewish thought. After I read your book, I read John Levinson's Death and Resurrection of the Beloved Son that was written across the street. I read Nierenberg's Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition. And as all the panel was speaking, I was thinking about Mary Boyd's book, Redeeming Our Sacred Story, which all three of the works are critiques of the Christian use of the cross to persecute Jews. What the symbolism of the cross means to Jews is very, very extremely negative.
I'm deeply impressed by Jesus' Jewishness and have tried to be accountable to that in Power in the Blood. In talking about the way in which many times the Christian signification misses the whole point of the Jewish sacrificial system, which is to expunge sin and its impact on the community. To expunge, not to appease God, but to expiate. And the difference between expiation and propitiation is a God concept issue. It's like, oh, my God loves me. My God loves me eternally. My God holds me in regard, in high regard, does not regard me as a sinner. It's not that Jesus died for my sins, but that Jesus died in order to demonstrate the willingness of God to expunge my sin in that way because of blood loss and blood and its value. But that doesn't make the crucifixion of Jesus necessary. It just makes it a choice. It makes it an agency of God, which I find profoundly implicated in Jewish theology. God is the one who has agency, not us. You know, we don't impress God with making of ourselves or making others sacrifice. I remember one time I was in a group of church folk who had read the book. And, you know, they were not scholars, but they understood something very profound about the book. One man got up and said, I don't really understand all of the words, because, you know, theological language can be really jargonistic. He said, but I know one thing, she don't like no suffering. And I was like, you got that, you got the whole point. You got the whole point. And so why do we make that be the definition of what it is to be Christian? That's not even Jesus-like. Jesus, like, okay, you know, I'll go to the ends of the earth for you. You know, but this is my agency. I'm not doing it because, you know, God needs this. God needs for this to stop. So.
Amen.
Any of the panelists want to add anything, any comments?
Maybe
Are there
just
questions you may have for each other? Go ahead.
Maybe just one thing. Another thing that Bob's question helps us think about is interreligious dialogue. And going in the direction of Dr. Thomas pointing out articles. In 2011, Monica Coleman's article, Must I Be Womanist, which engages third wave womanism and the fact that the first two waves of womanism were primarily Christians. And the third one is engaging the fact that Alice Walker wasn't Christian. And so it opens up the conversation to a broader range of conversationalists.
I think, can you all hear me? You're bringing up Dr. Coleman is so important because I think I want to begin by saying that this statement is not anti-Dr. Monica Coleman. It is a critique that I have that she said that womanists did not engage interreligious kinds of things, which said to me she had not read Dr. Terrell.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Now, it wasn't a full book, but the engagement was seriously mentioned. And so I just take that critique and say that something was missing, and that she had not read that.
Helpful.
So I think in terms of where we can go with this conversation, I got a mic. Thank you, sorry. In terms of where we can go with this conversation, I think all of the opportunities that have been mentioned are important. I also wish, as I'm doing work on supporting activists, many of whom have walked away from the church, but not away from God, because there's too much, the struggle the way in which the struggle with atonement is being waged in the church is not palatable for them. They refuse to participate in it because I think that I think there's just a good common sense is helping them to say that's a bad idea. I think there's also some of what you call native spirituality that says this is a bad idea. But even when we talk about interreligious dialogue, I think it's important for us to think about what does interreligious dialogue look within African American communities, right? I mean, it's not just a matter of crossing ethnicity and race, but the interreligious realities of African American spirituality. And what does that mean for activity in the streets right now? I think that if the church could get on board, there's a way in which I really wish that Black activists now, millennial activists, had an opportunity to really sit down with you and this work. Because this is not the message. This critique around Christ, this brand of Jesus that you talking about, the Lord is talking about, this is not the Jesus that they have been hearing in congregations, right? But but to hear from a Black woman who has had the distinct experience of violence that you have, and who's very public about it, but doesn't let that be, that is a part of your conversation. It is not the totality of your conversation, and you are working within the tradition to hold people accountable to the fullness of what the tradition can do. I think that it would be an important opportunity to reclaim Christianity as a viable framework. And because it's not a narrow Christianity. It's a Christianity that's dealing with the Bhagavad Gita, a Christianity that has room for conversation with Oya. You see, a wide conversation that would allow them to own all of who they are. So I'm with you on interreligious dialogue in the way that we're talking about it, but I think I want us to take this to the streets because they're running away from the church, I think, for good reason. But I think that there are ways in which the church can be who they need it to be if they had more access to conversation with you. And quite honestly, if everyday clergy persons weren't afraid to read This Power in the Blood, weren't afraid of the critique, weren't afraid of stepping outside of the boundaries and the limits.
Well, if I could for a moment draw our attention back to what I still like to call, even though I know we call it the Black National Anthem, I grew up with it being called the Negro National Anthem. And I mean, I was a child when we did that. I want to clarify that. But you know, these things imprint themselves upon you. But I think that one particular phrase which is germane to the conversation, particularly about the idea of atonement as it exists within the Black Christian tradition, is treading our path through the blood of the slaughter. Right, so one of the things that I think that certainly James Cone begins to do, and I mean, he's really only beginning to do it. I mean, he's waiting for someone else to take up that work, is to take seriously what does it mean to begin to look at, you know, he's talking about Christology, I'm speaking specifically about the atonement, soteriology. When one is talking about these doctrines as they are shaped and framed within a community where death and martyrdom was a daily occurrence, right? If one looks at, and you go back and you look at the statistics in terms of the average lifespan of people, particularly in plantations, and how short and brutal those lives were. This past year, we went to a plantation. It was the plantation that's looking at slavery from the vantage point of the slaves. And I mean, you know, it really was a stupid trip. It was. Because, no, and I say that because I was the one who organized it. And I thought, well, maybe if we go and we see it from the slaves' vantage point, it will mean something more to us. It was even more shattering seeing it from there. Because there was something called the Children's Memorial, and it showed how in this one county, within the span of just a few years, thousands of children didn't make it to the age of 3. Okay, so we come through that period, right, where life is not only cheap, but life is short and brutal. where lynchings were not only a post-Reconstruction phenomenon, they were one of the means of control of slave communities, right? You come to the period of Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction. This is even before we get to the Red Summer and that turn in Black history. And there's virtually no family that is not touched by someone who didn't come home. And it wasn't because they ran north, it was because they went in a swamp somewhere. And you remember one of the cardinal things about lynching, right, and this is something I can't remember whether or not Cone touches on it or not, but you were not allowed to bury the bodies until they told you it was okay. So as a consequence, these symbols were constantly in front of you. Some of you may remember the scene from James Brown's story about the first pair of good shoes he got was when he took them off of somebody who had been lynched. You may remember from the butler when he ran away from the plantation upon which his father had been killed before his eyes. One of the things that he ran into were two young Black men hanging from a light post. So I say all of that to say that there is a way in which the atonement theory, and I wouldn't even call it atonement theory because it's talking about something very different than what many Western theologians is talking about, right? The sacrifice of Jesus to the powers of evil and the people who are witnessing it not being swallowed up by that evil is at the core of what I think we would describe as a Black atonement theory, if there is one. And I guess a part of what I want to suggest, and it's a question, and it's not pushing back against certainly anything you said, Dr. Crumpton, but my sense is that at the same time that we should challenge the way that it is being deployed and utilized, we also need to appreciate where it came from. Because by appreciating where it came from, we can then begin to raise the critical theological question, how do we then appropriate what they were trying to do? And what they were trying to do was saying that in the midst of treading our path through the blood of the slaughter, we are not swallowed up by the evil that creates the slaughter.
Amen.
Yeah. That's a lot, and I'm so thankful. There's a part of me that just cannot let go of the ways in which it is so deeply, profoundly wrong and so deeply, profoundly prevalent that I don't think that I don't think I'm saying it to not appreciate that because a key commitment for me is honoring our ancestors. I'm just trying to figure out if there's a way to honor them and at the same time hold that honoring with my own accountability to holding others accountable to the situation that they had created, right? So it's like I honor and respect their faith, but as I stand on their shoulders, it makes me really sad to still experience to some degree, or if I don't know others or see others who are still experiencing that same kind of pain and still are, we shouldn't still have to have that same struggle, right, theologically as well as practically.
Right, and I agree with that. And I think a piece of what that draws us to in asking the question, how do we begin to get out of the unhelpful dimensions of this, is through the appreciation of what was it trying to accomplish. And one of the things that it takes frequently us a long time, and I'll just claim it self-referentially, is to understand then that talking with folk like Bart, talking with folk, just of no help whatsoever, right? It's really just spinning my wheels and wasting my time. Right, talking about other kinds of sort of constructions of quote-unquote the atonement that are from the vantage point that presume that life is something that's lived with appreciation and value, as opposed to people who are presuming it from our perspective. And it's not that I'm trying to ghettoize it, but what I am trying to say is that there's so few of us who are trained in institutions where we have the lacuna of being able to do theological reflection that actually get the conversation and tools to help understand what the people were trying to do, and then begin to do the reconstructive work of doing what they were trying to do, because what they were trying to do in post-Reconstruction America, as bad as things are now, it's not then. So what that means is that their prescription for the problem,
something in it,
you know, is something that needs to be changed. But the point is that their identification of the problem, right? And that's the problem of Black life asserting itself as something sacramental that will not be swallowed up by the evil that has taken this life. And I mean, that's when we can do the kind of work that Michelle Watkins is doing, right? To sort of go back to the patristic era and begin to look at Irenaeus and a number of those folk, and they become interesting conversations. So, I mean, for me, like, you know, I could just, you know, read down the names, you know, Nygren, Bart, all of those folk. You read those to get through your exams, but they're no help to you at all for answering these questions.
We'll let Dr. Thomas have a last comment.
Thank you so much. This is a very rich conversation. So, Dr. Ray, President Ray, you remember a couple years ago that we went down to where Michael Brown was murdered. Yes. Black scholars, Dr. Pamela Lacey pulled together Black scholars to journey to Ferguson for the first year anniversary of Michael Brown, and there was a very large crowd. But part of what was so tremendous is that Dr. Lacey arranged for us to meet with various people. Yes, you were there. Several of us were there. So my question really comes out of the young people that we saw and who talked with us on that panel. And it was Reverend Tracy Blackman who got a call from them, the young people, young activists, and they were trying to figure out where to go next. And somebody said something about a minister, and that she had met a minister at like the laundromat or some not in church, and that maybe we could call that woman. And so they did, and so they were all talking on the phone. I think it was a conference call, and Dr. Blackman didn't say anything that was religious. She very intentionally did not, because when they wanted to know, kind of edged to, well, what should we do next, and kind of listen for her voice, she said, what should you all do next? What should you all do next? She did not come with the way that some of the ministers, come, bringing the theological jargon, the typical things that we hear in church. She stayed away from that, and I think they came toward it then. So I just wanted, I was so struck with Dr. Ray when he was introducing that panel. He said, "You are the ones that we have been waiting for." And many of the folks were transgender. You are the ones we've been waiting for in terms of engaging your voice in this matter. And it was a beautiful thing. I just wanted to give that as a live example of what I think you're raising, Dr. Crumpton, about how do you reach the millennials who were before us. And I think that the way that Dr. Ray said you are the ones, and just they opened the conversation, and they were our professors. So that's one of the ways that they were honored, I think, and we were humble. They were our professors, and we were humble. Would you not agree? I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything about that, but you know, we learned, yeah. So just wanted to bring that up as an example of how that unfolded at that moment.
And one of the bridges to the young people is art. Mm-hmm. And I was able, in that gathering, actually during that time I was ill. I had blindness from my diabetes. Mm-hmm. I was actually blind when we were in Ferguson. I could not see. And, but I was able to share in singing with the group, my gift of singing with the group, and it broke down barriers between the perceived role of an academic and a minister and young people who have who don't comport with the rules and the regulations of church. And who are serious about doing the work of community redemption. And so I think that, you know, just as that piece of artwork in my home stimulated my thinking about the cross, stimulated my curiosity about how God is imaged and how we are to receive the so-called good news of the gospel. You know, the sometimes so-called good news of the gospel. It's sometimes so-called. Then we need art to make the kinds of connections, make the kinds of bridges that we need from one generation to the next. They need to share theirs with us, and we need to share what we know, what we have, what we've been given with them.
Could I have one last word?
I feel like a preacher who has to close and closes 3 times. So yeah, go right ahead.
Okay. And this is the final word. That all of you who are students sitting here listening to us, we worked hard to be able to sit here and say that we need to go outside of the classroom. You need to work hard in the classroom so you can earn the right to do the same thing. Do y'all hear what I'm saying?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
thank you.
Just one last thing. One of my favorite images, Dr. Thomas, from that, your daughter, Dora, went. Jada was there. My son was there. They were on the front row. Now, whether they were on the front row to get away from their parents, but they were on the front row at that conference. Give our esteemed panelists one more round of applause. And we thank the creator for the gift that is Dr. Joanne Marie Terrell. Thank you for your presence. Don't forget the envelopes, you know, that love offering, love gift on your way out. There is still food. There's a basket where you can put your offering. Thank you all so much for being here. Good night and be safe.